Elias was a man who spoke the language of engines better than he spoke to people. His workshop, a converted aircraft hangar on the edge of the Nevada desert, was a sanctuary for mechanical orphans, rusty tractors, seized-up vintage cars, and industrial generators that others had left to rot. He didn't buy things to flip them quickly. He bought them to understand them. His latest acquisition, however, was a gamble even for him. It was listed simply as Lot 72, industrial surplus, heavy machinery, non-functional, at a government liquidation auction. The photo showed nothing but a massive, rot-resistant wooden crate bound in iron straps, stenciled with faded warnings from a bygone era. Elias won it for the price of the scrap metal weight, sensing that the sheer heaviness of the box hinted at something dense, complex, and potentially valuable. When the delivery truck dropped the crate onto the concrete floor of his shop, the thud vibrated through the soles of his boots. It took him 2 hours just to pry the iron straps loose. As he leveraged the final wooden panel away, the smell of cosmoline, a heavy, wax-like preservative used by the military, filled the air. Beneath layers of oil-soaked canvas lay the beast. It was an engine, but unlike any he had ever seen in 30 years of mechanics. It was a V8 configuration, but with strange, turbine-like additions on the intake manifold and exhaust ports that spiraled in a way that defied standard airflow dynamics. The metal wasn't cast iron or aluminum. It was a dark, matte alloy that felt cold and strangely smooth to the touch, untouched by rust despite the crate's age. Elias began the initial assessment, walking around the object like a predator sizing up prey. There were no serial numbers, no manufacturer stamps, and no casting marks. It was a ghost engine, a piece of machinery that officially didn't exist. He ran his gloved hand along the valve covers, noting the precision of the machining. The tolerances were incredibly tight, far superior to mass-produced engines of the 1950s or 60s, which is where the design language seemed to originate. He reached for his socket set to remove the valve cover, wanting to see the rocker arms and pushrods, but the bolts were proprietary. 5-sided heads that required him to machine a custom tool just to open the first layer. This was not meant to be serviced by a regular mechanic. It was meant to be sealed. Hey everyone! We are taking a quick break from the teardown because we need your help to keep these restorations going. We are incredibly close to hitting 10,000 subscribers, and we want to smash that goal with this video. If you love mechanical mysteries and hidden treasures, please hit that subscribe button right now. Also, if you want to support the channel directly, check out the Super Thanks button below. It helps us fund these risky auction buys. And let's get a conversation started. Drop a comment below and tell us, what city and country are you watching from? We love seeing our global crew. Now, let's get back to the engine. With the custom tool fabricated, Elias applied torque to the first bolt. It cracked loose with a satisfying snap, the seal of 50 years finally breaking. He systematically removed the remaining bolts and lifted the heavy valve cover. What lay beneath made him gasp. There were no standard rocker arms. Instead, the valve train was operated by a desmodromic system usually reserved for high-performance Italian race cars, but far more robust and complex. The camshafts were hollow and drilled with intricate oil passages that seemed to double as a cooling system. But the real anomaly was the oil itself. As he drained the sump to inspect the internals, the fluid that poured out wasn't black sludge. It was a translucent, amber liquid that had maintained its viscosity perfectly after decades of storage. He moved to the front of the engine to remove the timing cover. This was usually the place where manufacturers hid the identifying marks. As he scraped away the thick gasket sealant, he found a small, brass plaque riveted to the block, facing inward so it could only be seen during a full teardown. He shone his inspection light on it. It didn't have a company name like Ford or GM. It simply read, Project X-77. Prototype. Property of U.S. Department of Defense. Do not duplicate. Elias realized he hadn't just bought a scrap engine. He had purchased a piece of Cold War history that was likely intended to revolutionize armored vehicle propulsion before being scrapped and forgotten. The deeper he dismantled the engine, the more baffled he became. The pistons were coated in a ceramic material that was decades ahead of its time, designed to withstand immense heat. The connecting rods were made of titanium, a material so expensive in the mid-20th century that using it in a combustion engine was unheard of. But the true mystery lay in the intake system. The carburetor was missing, replaced by a mechanical fuel injection system that looked like a puzzle box of brass gears and pressure diaphragms. As Elias unbolted the intake manifold to clean the ports, he noticed that the weight was off. The manifold was too heavy on the left side. He flipped it over and saw a faint seam in the casting that shouldn't be there. It looked like a welding repair, but the quality was too high. It was a concealment. He took the manifold to the workbench and clamped it down. Using a fine grit sanding wheel, he gently abraded the surface of the seam. The sparks changed color, indicating a different metal filler. He carefully cut along the line, prying open a false chamber built directly into the airflow channel. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and lead foil, was a watertight cylinder. Elias pulled it out, his heart pounding against his ribs. This wasn't part of the engine's function. This was a stash. He unscrewed the cap of the cylinder. Inside were not just blueprints, but a set of handwritten technical journals and a physical key made of solid silver. The journals were dated 1958 and belonged to a lead engineer named Dr. Elias Thorne. The first page contained a chilling entry: "They are shutting us down. The efficiency of this engine threatens the oil contracts. I cannot let the technology die. I am burying the heart of the machine inside the machine itself." Elias spent the next 6 hours reading under the harsh hum of his workshop's fluorescent lights, completely forgetting the grease on his hands and the fatigue in his bones. The journals of Dr. Elias Thorne were not merely technical manuals. They were the desperate testament of a genius watching his life's work being buried by bureaucracy and greed. The handwriting was jagged and hurried, detailing the specifications of the X-77, which Thorne referred to as the Phantom Drive. The engine wasn't designed for speed, although it possessed immense power. It was designed for impossible efficiency. According to the notes, the engine utilized a closed-loop thermal recovery system that recycled nearly 95% of its own exhaust heat back into mechanical energy, a thermodynamic feat that broke the accepted laws of physics in 1958. It effectively tripled the range of any vehicle it powered, a strategic advantage that would have changed the course of the war and the global economy. The journal explained the necessity of the silver key. The engine had a failsafe, a physical lock built into the casting to prevent reverse engineering by enemy agents or unauthorized activation. Thorne had hidden the critical component, the variable compression modulator, inside the block itself, locked behind a mechanism that looked like a standard freeze plug. Without this component engaged, the engine was just a heavy paperweight. The pistons would never compress the fuel mixture correctly. Elias looked at the engine block with new eyes. He located the freeze plug on the rear of the block, near the flywheel housing. To the untrained eye, it was just a rusted circle of steel, but Elias saw the faint outline of a keyway obscured by years of hardened varnish. He cleaned the keyhole with a dental pick, his breath held in anticipation. He took the heavy silver key, which felt warm in his hand, and inserted it into the slot. It fit with the precision of a bank vault. He turned it clockwise. There was a deep, resonant clunk from deep inside the cast iron block, followed by the hiss of pneumatic pressure releasing. A rectangular section of the engine block, perfectly machined to be invisible when closed, slid outward about 4 inches. It was a drawer made of solid steel, hidden within the water jacket of the engine. Inside this secret compartment sat the heart Dr. Thorne had written about. It was a cylindrical device made of tungsten and brass, intricately carved with fluid channels. This was the modulator. It looked like a piece of jewelry rather than a car part. Elias realized the genius of the design. Thorne had made the engine useless without this specific, removable core. If the military scrapped the project, they would only be scrapping a shell. Thorne had kept the soul of the machine safe, hoping that one day someone with the skill to understand it would find it. Elias carefully extracted the modulator. It was heavy, dense, and smelled faintly of ozone. He returned to the journal. The final entry described the fuel mixture. This was the most shocking revelation. The X-77 didn't run on standard gasoline. It required a specific lean mixture that could be synthesized from low-grade kerosene and water vapor, injected at extreme pressures. The engine was a hybrid of steam and internal combustion principles, designed to run on almost anything flammable. This was why it was suppressed. An engine that could run efficiently on cheap, low-grade fuel would have devastated the oil industry's booming post-war profits. Elias realized the magnitude of what sat on his workbench. He wasn't just restoring an engine, he was resurrecting a suppressed revolution. The restoration process changed gears instantly. It was no longer about cleaning, it was about surgical reassembly. Elias spent the next 2 weeks meticulously rebuilding the beast. He ordered custom gaskets cut from modern materials to withstand the pressures Thorne described. He polished the cylinder walls to a mirror finish. He reassembled the complex desmodromic valve train, timing the gears with the precision of a watchmaker. Every bolt was torqued to the exact specification listed in the journal. When he finally slid the tungsten modulator back into its slot and turned the silver key to lock it in active mode, the engine seemed to hum with potential energy. He needed to test it. He couldn't just drop it into a car, he needed a static test stand. He welded together a heavy-duty steel frame, bolting the massive engine mounts to the floor of the hangar. He fabricated a custom fuel tank, mixing the specific ratio of kerosene and distilled water as per Thorne's formula. The final step was the electrical system. The engine used a 24-volt military starter. Elias hooked up 2 heavy-duty marine batteries. The moment of truth had arrived. The hangar was silent, save for the distant howl of the desert wind. He connected the fuel lines, primed the mechanical injection system, and walked to the control panel he had rigged up. He reached for the starter button. His hand trembled slightly. If Thorne was right, this engine would change history. If he was wrong, or if the seals failed, the pressure could turn the engine into a bomb. Elias took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and pressed the button. The starter motor whined, a high-pitched, electric cry that echoed against the corrugated metal walls of the hangar. For 3 agonizing seconds, the machine did nothing but spin, the heavy internal components churning the oil. Then, without a sputter or a backfire, the X-77 caught. It didn't roar like a typical American V8, nor did it clatter like a diesel. It emitted a sound that Elias had never heard before, a deep, resonant thrum overlaid with the sharp, sucking hiss of the turbine intake. It sounded less like an engine and more like a breathing organism, a rhythmic, powerful inhalation that vibrated the concrete floor beneath his feet. Elias stared at the gauges, his eyes widening in disbelief. The tachometer held a steady 800 revolutions per minute, dead idle, but the oil pressure was instant and massive. The most shocking reading, however, was the exhaust temperature. On a normal engine, the manifold would be scalding hot within seconds. Elias cautiously reached out his hand, hovering it over the exhaust headers. They were warm, but not hot. He moved his hand closer, finally touching the metal. It was barely lukewarm. The journal was right. The thermal recovery system was working perfectly, cannibalizing its own waste heat and feeding it back into the combustion cycle. The laws of thermodynamics weren't being broken, but they were being bent to their absolute limit. He throttled the engine up. The sound shifted from a thrum to a scream, the turbine spinning into a blur. The torque caused the heavy steel test stand to groan, straining against the bolts anchored in the concrete. The power output was terrifying. According to his calculations, this compact block was producing torque figures rivaling a modern freight train locomotive, yet it was consuming fuel at the rate of a lawnmower. He watched the clear plastic fuel line. The level of the kerosene-water mixture barely moved. It was the holy grail of mechanics. Infinite efficiency. Elias realized he was looking at the machine that could have saved the world from energy crises, wars over oil, and environmental collapse, and it had been sitting in a wooden box for 60 years. After 20 minutes of running, the engine began to do something else. The tungsten modulator, the heart he had inserted, began to glow with a faint, blue luminescence. It wasn't heat, it was some form of ionization. The air in the shop started to smell like a thunderstorm, sharp with ozone. Elias felt the hair on his arms stand up. He quickly shut the fuel valve, cutting the supply. The engine didn't die immediately. It spun down slowly, the heavy flywheel carrying the momentum for nearly a minute before silence returned to the hangar. The silence felt heavier now, charged with the weight of the secret. Elias went back to the crate, searching for anything he might have missed. He pulled out the oil-soaked canvas liners and the wooden bracing. At the very bottom of the crate, wedged between the wood slats and the outer frame, he found a thick manila envelope sealed with wax. It had been hidden so well that it looked like part of the insulation. He broke the seal. Inside were not technical drawings, but legal documents. They were patent applications, fully drafted and signed by Dr. Thorne and a witness, but they lacked the official stamp of the Patent Office. Attached to them was a deed of transfer. The documents revealed the terrifying truth of the engine's origin. The X-77 wasn't government property initially. It was a private invention by Thorne, seized under the War Powers Act during a period of national emergency. However, the seizure was contested. The legal papers detailed a loophole. If the project was abandoned or decommissioned by the military, the rights to the intellectual property and the physical prototype would revert to the creator or the holder of this specific deed. The government had made a fatal clerical error. By selling the crate as scrap surplus at a public auction, they had officially abandoned the project. Elias, holding the receipt for Lot 72 and this deed, was now the legal owner of the most advanced combustion technology on Earth. But ownership brought immediate danger. The final document in the envelope was a letter from Thorne to his estranged son, intended to be sent if Thorne disappeared. It warned that the modulator contained a specific isotope signature. When active, when glowing blue, it emitted a low-frequency radiation that could be detected by specific military scanning equipment designed to track nuclear assets. Thorne had built it as a tracking beacon for himself, but now it was a liability. Elias realized that by running the engine for 20 minutes, he had essentially lit a flare in the electromagnetic spectrum. He didn't panic. He was a mechanic. He fixed problems. He grabbed a roll of lead flashing he used for roof repairs and began frantically wrapping the engine block, creating a makeshift radiation shield. He needed to mask the signature before anyone looking for lost assets pinpointed his hangar. Once the engine was shrouded in lead and heavy welding blankets, Elias made a phone call. He didn't call the police or the news. He called an old contact named Silas, a patent attorney who specialized in difficult, provenance, and recovered technology. Silas arrived 6 hours later, driving a nondescript sedan. When Elias showed him the engine, the journals, and the unfiled patent deed, the lawyer's face went pale. He spent an hour verifying the signatures and the auction receipt. Finally, he looked up, taking off his glasses. "Elias," he said, his voice trembling, "do you have any idea what you've done? You haven't just bought an engine. This deed, because of the specific wording of the release and the auction laws of the state, this deed is valid. You own the patent rights to the thermal recovery cycle. Every car manufacturer, every aerospace company, every defense contractor, they have been trying to crack this efficiency for decades. You hold the key." Silas estimated the value of the prototype and the intellectual property rights not in the thousands, but in the tens of millions. However, they couldn't just sell it on eBay. They needed to authenticate it and protect it before the government realized their mistake and came to reclaim it under a claim of national security. They needed to move the engine. The hangar was no longer safe. The 20-minute test run might have gone unnoticed, or it might have triggered a silent alarm in a basement at the Pentagon. They had to load the beast onto Elias's flatbed truck and move it to a secure, underground facility that Silas used for high-value asset storage. As they rigged the engine to the hoist to lift it onto the truck, the workshop lights flickered. Then, the phone on the wall rang. It was a landline that Elias rarely used. He looked at Silas. Silas shook his head, signaling him not to answer. The phone rang 4 times, then stopped. A moment later, a black SUV rolled slowly past the front of the hangar, its headlights off, crunching softly on the gravel road. They were already being watched. The clerical error had been noticed. The race to secure the fortune was no longer a legal battle, it was a physical escape. The silence of the desert night was broken only by the heavy ratcheting of the chain hoist. Elias and Silas worked in total darkness, illuminated only by the faint red glow of the truck's dashboard lights to avoid drawing attention. The black SUV had disappeared around the bend of the canyon road, but they knew it was circling back. They lowered the lead-wrapped engine onto the bed of Elias's battered 1970s flatbed truck, the suspension groaning under the concentrated weight of the prototype. Elias strapped it down with heavy-duty chains, his hands moving with the muscle memory of a lifetime of hauling heavy machinery. This was no longer a restoration project, it was a tactical extraction. They weren't just moving metal, they were moving a national secret that had already been flagged by a silent alarm somewhere in Washington. Elias took the wheel, signaling Silas to follow in his sedan, but keep a mile distance to act as a lookout. He didn't take the main highway. Instead, he steered the heavy truck onto the Wash, a dried-out riverbed that locals used as a shortcut but was treacherous for anyone who didn't know the terrain. He killed his headlights, driving solely by the light of the moon and his intimate knowledge of the topographical shadows. The truck bounced violently over the rocks, the engine in the back shifting slightly against its restraints, a terrifying reminder of the volatile cargo they were carrying. If the tungsten modulator was jostled too hard while still warm, the radiation leakage could increase, or worse, the pressurized fuel residues could ignite. 10 minutes into the drive, Silas's voice crackled over a handheld radio Elias kept in the cab. The black SUV had been joined by 2 others. They were sweeping the main road with high-powered spotlights. The government, or the private contractors hired to clean up the government's mess, had escalated the search immediately. They weren't looking for a stolen car. They were executing a grid search for a weapon of mass strategic value. Elias pushed the old truck harder, the tires fighting for grip in the loose sand. He navigated a narrow ravine that hid the truck from the horizon line, effectively vanishing from the visual spectrum of the pursuers. He knew a back entrance to the industrial sector of the city, a route that bypassed the surveillance cameras on the highway on-ramps. They arrived at Silas's secure facility just as dawn began to bleed purple across the eastern sky. The location wasn't a bank vault, but an unassuming, windowless concrete warehouse in the middle of a logistics park, disguised as a document storage firm. It was climate-controlled, shielded against electronic snooping, and fortified with steel-reinforced doors. Elias backed the truck into the loading bay, and the heavy shutter rolled down behind them, sealing them off from the world. For the first time in hours, Elias exhaled. The adrenaline crash hit him hard, his hands shaking as he unchained the engine. They were safe, but the engine was now a prisoner again, just in a different box. Silas didn't waste time. He summoned a third party to the warehouse, not a buyer, but a validator. At 8 a.m., a small, severe-looking woman named Dr. Kovic arrived. She was a former Department of Energy auditor and a specialist in historical propulsion systems. When Elias peeled back the lead sheeting and the welding blankets to reveal the X-77, Kovic stopped dead in her tracks. She didn't need to look at the paperwork. She recognized the design immediately. She pulled out a Geiger counter and a spectrometer, running them over the casing. The readings confirmed the specific alloy composition Dr. Thorne had described, a mixture of steel and slight traces of iridium, an element used to harden the block against the immense heat of the thermal recycling process. Dr. Kovic turned to them, her expression grave. She explained that the X-77 wasn't just suppressed because of oil interests. That was the cover story. It was suppressed because the manufacturing process of the engine block itself was deemed too toxic and expensive to replicate at scale in the 1950s. The Phantom drive was the only one that had survived the testing phase without cracking. The other 5 prototypes had catastrophic failures. This specific engine, serial number 001, was the golden sample, the only proof that the physics actually worked. By possessing it, Elias didn't just have the patent rights. He held the only functional physical model in existence. Without this engine to study, the blueprints were useless theories. With it, the technology could be reverse-engineered using modern materials that didn't exist in 1958. The stakes shifted dramatically. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about leverage. Silas revealed that he had already drafted a communique to the Department of Defense's Legacy Assets Division. They weren't going to hide the engine. They were going to hold it hostage legally. The clerical error of selling it at auction gave Elias clear title, a legal nightmare for the government. If they tried to seize it by force, Silas would release the technical schematics to the public domain immediately, destroying the strategic advantage. They had to buy it back, and they had to pay the consulting fee for the restoration. However, the engine had one final secret to reveal. As Dr. Kovic was inspecting the intake manifold, she found a secondary stamp near the fuel injection rail. It was a date code, revised 1962. This date was 4 years after the project was officially cancelled and Dr. Thorne supposedly hid the engine. Elias realized the implications instantly. Thorne hadn't just hidden the engine in 1958, he had continued to work on it in secret for years, upgrading it. The engine on the pallet was a Mark II version, something that appeared in no government records at all. This meant the government didn't even know this version existed. Elias had bought a ghost of a ghost. The warehouse phone rang. It was the front desk security. The black SUVs hadn't found them by following the truck. They had tracked Silas's car. They were outside. But they weren't breaking down the doors. A man in a suit was standing at the intercom, holding a briefcase, asking to speak with the current owner of Lot 72. The chase was over. The negotiation was about to begin. Elias wiped the grease from his hands with a rag, looked at the gleaming, futuristic machine that had caused all this chaos, and nodded to Silas. It was time to open the door and see what a miracle was worth. The heavy steel roller door ascended with a mechanical groan, revealing the stark morning light and the silhouette of Agent Sterling. He entered alone, leaving his security team by the black SUVs. Sterling was a man who exuded the calm, terrifying authority of someone who erased problems for a living. He didn't look at Elias or Silas. His eyes were locked instantly on the X-77. The moment he saw the revised 1962 date code stamped near the injection rail, his professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second. A flicker of genuine shock crossed his face. The government records ended in 1958. Elias held a machine that, according to the Pentagon's deepest archives, was impossible. He held the ghost of the ghost. The negotiation that followed was not a shouting match, but a high-stakes chess game played on a folding table in a dusty warehouse. Silas, the lawyer, laid out the doomsday option. If the government attempted to seize the engine without compensation, the full technical schematics, including the thermal recovery loop and the fuel synthesis formula, would be uploaded to every major open-source engineering database in the world within 5 minutes. The technology would belong to everyone, nullifying any strategic advantage the U.S. military hoped to regain. Sterling understood the threat. He wasn't there to arrest them. He was there to contain a leak that had started 60 years ago. However, the Mark II modification changed the valuation entirely. Dr. Kovic, the validator, pointed out that the 1962 upgrade included a plasma ignition prechamber, a technology that modern aerospace engineers were currently struggling to perfect for hypersonic missiles. Elias had fixed it in his garage using 1960s tools because he followed the genius of Dr. Thorne. The engine wasn't just a piece of history. It was a blueprint for the future of warfare and transport. The government couldn't just buy the metal. They had to buy the innovation gap. They were purchasing 50 years of lost progress. Sterling made a phone call on a secure satellite line. He spoke in low, coded tones for 10 minutes while looking at the glowing tungsten modulator. When he hung up, he slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a National Security Asset Acquisition contract. It granted Elias and Silas full immunity for possessing classified materials and classified the payment as a consulting and recovery fee to avoid public scrutiny. The number at the bottom of the page was staggering: $28.5 million USD. It was a price calculated to ensure total silence and the immediate handover of every scrap of paper, every tool, and the engine itself. Elias signed. He felt a strange pang of loss as he put the pen down. He was a mechanic who loved machines, and he was signing away the greatest machine ever built. But he knew the X-77 was too dangerous to exist in a private garage. It was a beast that needed a cage stronger than he could build. The transfer was immediate. The team from the SUVs, specialized military logistics officers, entered the warehouse. They didn't use rough hands. They treated the engine with the reverence of a religious artifact. They encased it in a specialized lead-line transport pod, locking it away from the world once again. As the pod was sealed, Elias caught one last glimpse of the chrome valve covers. He realized he was likely the only human being alive who had ever heard it run. The convoy departed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the warehouse empty and silent. The check, however, was real. The funds cleared within 24 hours. The windfall was transformative. Elias didn't buy a yacht or a mansion. He did exactly what Dr. Thorne would have wanted. He bought the entire industrial park where his hangar stood and founded the Thorne Elias Institute for Mechanical Preservation. It was a massive facility dedicated to finding, restoring, and displaying lost industrial history, though nothing quite as classified as the X-77. He used a portion of the fortune to set up a scholarship fund for young engineers and mechanics, specifically those interested in alternative propulsion. He wanted to ensure that the next genius who had an idea like the Phantom Drive wouldn't have to hide it in a wooden crate. He also kept one secret for himself. Before the agents arrived, while he was wrapping the engine, Elias had memorized the specific gear ratio of the desmodromic valve train. He didn't write it down, and he didn't sell it. He kept it in his head, a private puzzle he would think about while working on old tractors and rusty trucks. Years later, rumors would surface in the automotive world about a new generation of military hybrid tanks with impossible range and silent thermal signatures. Elias would read these articles with a knowing smile, sipping his coffee in his high-tech, pristine workshop. He knew the source. The scrap metal he bought for the price of weight had finally been put to use. He had uncovered a secret, forced the hand of the most powerful military on Earth, and walked away a multi-millionaire. The X-77 was gone, buried in a black site, but for 20 glorious minutes he had made the ghost sing. And that, for a mechanic like Elias, was worth more than the money. Thanks for watching this incredible restoration story. If you enjoyed the ride, don't forget to like and subscribe for more lost treasures.